Hi, it's Dennis Daly. My second job in radio was working for nearly a decade in a city called Vincennes, Indiana, on the Wabash. We were in a building that afforded a view across the river to Illinois. They were an hour behind us over there. I went back once and talked to an old friend, GUS STEVENS from Vincennes University, about the history of Vincennes, which has never really been exploited to the rest of the nation.
Well, this is certainly the oldest town in the Indiana Territory, which consisted of the states of Indiana, Wisconsin, Michigan, Illinois, and a part of Minnesota. And it was started as a French fort by the Sieur de Vincennes. His name was Francis Morgan Marie Bessot, and the Sieur de Vincennes was a French title. And at that time, France developed a series of forts between Detroit and New Orleans. I know there was one here at Vincennes and one in Natchez. And it was their idea to protect the interest of France in the New World. And the Sieur de Vincennes did establish the fort here. We have documented proof that he built his fort in 1732. But a few years later, he had the unfortunate experience of being burned at the stake by the Chickasaws down in the southern part of the country. And from that moment on, the town has been named for him, and so as it is today, Vincennes.
You know, it strikes me as being so funny in a way, but I guess everything gets anglicized. I don't know how to speak French, but I guess it's actually Vincennes. It's a suburb of Paris.
That's right.
If I'm not mistaken.
That's right.
And one of the most popular streets down here is Busserin, which is actually Busseron, if it were pronounced correctly.
That's right.
But, of course, we moved everything over here and corrupted the pronunciation.
One of the most famous streets in town is Vigo Street, V-I-G-O, which is for the Italian Francis Vigo. So the Italians get in the game here in Vincennes, too. Vigo was a very famous helper of George Rogers Clark in his march across the Illinois country to capture Fort Sackville, but mostly French in this community. Father Gibault is another of the very early priests that were into this country west of the Alleghenies and north of the Ohio, and he was able to get the French people in Vincennes, and the town was almost all French to support Clark's cause. So Clark only had to fight the British. He didn't have to fight the French too when he attacked Fort Sackville in 1779. But we do have some unusual street names. We've maintained our traditions down through the years, and right now we're approaching what is considered by many the largest historical memorial outside of Washington, D.C., and that is the George Rogers Clark Memorial.
My host is Robert R. GUS STEVENS, the curator of the Lewis Historical Collection at the Vincennes University Library. We started out in downtown Vincennes, and we've been walking around reminiscing about what the city was like years and decades and hundreds of years ago, and we continue our walking tour. We are on the banks of the Wabash River, and had it not been for that river, which was the interstate highway, the rivers were the interstate highway of the country at that time, the fort would not have been here because this was a main waterway. There's a huge, lovely bridge. If you've ever seen the Key Bridge in Washington, D.C., the style is very similar. And on the Illinois side, there's a marker over there to commemorate the fact that when Abraham Lincoln's family moved to Illinois, this is how they got there.
Certainly did. 1842, they crossed the Wabash here at Vincennes. In fact, they spent the night here getting a wheel repaired on their wagon. They came from Gentryville down here in southern Indiana. And, of course, once he got into Illinois, the rest is history. He made a pretty good name for himself.
Well, now, there would not have been a bridge here then, would there? It would have been a ferry or a
ferry.
And too deep for a ford.
And the ferry was only about 100 yards from where we stand right now.
Let's see if we can cross the highway. This is just now a state highway. At one time, it was US 50. And forgot how friendly everyone of the Midwest is. At one time, this carried all the traffic east and west between Cincinnati and St. Louis through here.
Yes, it did, and also from Louisville to Cahokia, Kaskaskia, the two major cities in the whole area before the French left, before the British took over control of the area, were Vincennes and Kaskaskia. Vincennes here on the Wabash, Kaskaskia over on the Mississippi, and there was a great deal of commerce and trade between the two cities.
Gus, let's turn around for a second and look back at Main Street. This was called Market Street. as many towns have market streets. It was where commerce was. It looks down to where the ferry used to be across the river.
Right.
It still says the Gimbal Corner there.
You know, Dennis, that's one of the world's great mercantile success stories. 1842, a man came to Vincennes with a pack on his back, a Jewish peddler, selling out of his pack. He liked the community, decided to stay. He started his little store at the corner of 2nd and Main Street, which we're looking at right now, and that man's name was Adam Gimbal. And it wasn't too many years that he had a small store in Danville, and then he had one in Milwaukee, and then they decided to go to Philadelphia, then they decided to go to New York, and then they decided to buy Saks Fifth Avenue, and the Gimbal brothers then were grown up, and they took over the corporation, and it became one of the world's great department stores, and it started right here in little old Vincennes, which we call the Old Post.
With a pack on a guy's back.
With a pack on a guy's back.
I know. I went to an exhibit of maps at the Smithsonian a couple of years ago, and I was impressed by the fact that the very early maps of North America show the cities that we would expect to see on the East Coast. Charleston, which we forget was a much more important city at one time, Baltimore, New York City, those types of places. But then there's nothing out here except Vincennes and Kaskaskia, and that's it.
They were the two major cities out on the frontier. Many of the Indian tribes were still in the area, and in fact, basically into the 1800s, they were still, through William Henry Harrison, which we'll get into later, the governor of the Indiana Territory. They were still having treaties with the various Indian tribes.
Well, now let's move forward. We started in the 1700s, and the French had a fort here, and it was named Vincennes. We are taking the long walk up to a monument, which is kind of a combination of the Lincoln Memorial and the Jefferson Memorial rolled into one. It dates from the 1930s, and as you mentioned, it's the largest monument to a single human being that's not in Washington, D.C. The Gateway Arch, of course, in St. Louis is larger, but it's not to one person. Bring us up to the Revolution and tell us how out here in the prairie there was a battle that people have forgotten about. If not a battle, a takeover, I should say.
Well, it was a battle overnight, but Clark seemed to have the situation well in hand, and Colonel Henry Hamilton, the governor of the British territory out of Detroit, surrendered on February the 25th, 1779. As you see etched in stone above the monument, Conquest of the West, and that's what it's considered today. And it was the only victory that we had in that rather bleak winter of 1778 and 79, which you might recall was when George Washington was cooling his heels at Valley Forge, and Clark was walking across the flooded Illinois country to attack the British here at Vincennes. The main problem was that the British were giving great pressure on the Kentucky settlements, and the major settlements, Kentucky being a part of Virginia at that time, were in Kentucky in the west, and it seemed that the British knew this, and they were inciting the Indians to put great pressure on those Kentucky settlements. And Patrick Henry, who was governor of Virginia, decided at the time that he had to do something to protect the settlers in Kentucky. He was more interested in that than he was this vast, what he called a wasteland north of the Ohio River, which we know of today as the old Northwest Territory. And his man of the time was George Rogers Clark. He talked to Clark. Clark agreed to come out, and Clark was able to put together an army of sorts in Pittsburgh. He went down to Corn Island, which is just off the present-day city of Louisville. It's underwater now. His army, they sailed down the Ohio, up the Mississippi to captured Kaskaskia and Cahokia. Both of those battles were not really battles at all. They were takeovers. And back in those days, troops on both sides tended to winter in the wintertime and tended to go into a bivouac situation.
Almost kind of a hibernation.
Exactly. And Clark felt that his one chance of capturing the British here at Fort Sackville in Vincennes was to be able to surprise him. surprise Henry Hamilton, the man in charge. And he did this by crossing the Illinois country from Kaskaskia all the way across southern Illinois. They walked. The rivers were out of their banks. It was a flooded time of year for the Little Wabash and all the various tributaries that flow into them. And so a good bit of the march was in water, and the last 10 miles of the march was in water up to the waist and chest. And Clark did surprise the British here at Vincennes. He did capture Fort Sackville after a short battle of about a day and a half. And the formal surrender took place on February the 25th, 1779. And if there are any stamp collectors in the audience, Dennis, they might remember the 1929 2-cent postage stamp, which had the surrender of Fort Sackville with George Rogers Clark receiving Henry Hamilton's sword.
Is it an overstatement, though, to say that even though the intent was to free up the Kentucky area from harassment by the British, that actually psychologically this was very important when the country was moving to the west, that after the Revolutionary War was over, that we at least had a foot in the door out here?
Oh, yes. The implications of what Clark did out on the frontier became magnified many, many times. It far outranked just protecting the settlers in Kentucky. And at the Treaty of Paris of 1783, why this was taken into consideration. Truthfully, this area would have been a real contention of whether the British were willing to give it up or not, had not Clark already has established himself in the territory.
We had mentioned earlier the influence of the French originally on this area. If you look at a map of the county, which is Knox County, which is a very British-sounding name, the roads run at a 45-degree angle. The city of Vincennes, partially because of the angle of the river here, is much at a 45-degree angle, which is very much in the tradition of the way French built things.
We also have some interesting French surveys in this area, and which later developed into the Vincennes donation lands. And actually, Thomas Jefferson, or actually Albert Gallatin, through Jefferson's orders, established a commission out here on the frontier just to straighten out the donation lands and to find out who owned what. He sent two people out, Nathaniel Ewing and Gallatin's very close friend, John Badelet, or Badelet, who was not a Frenchman, but he was a Genevan. In fact, he and Gallatin had both come from Geneva in present-day Switzerland, so he had a friend that he could trust out on the frontier. And over a period of 4 or 5 years, they were able to straighten out these kind of crazy land surveys.
I wanted to talk to Gus about the preservation of America's heritage, and I asked them whether or not it's an understatement that so many towns, big cities and small towns alike, seem to let their heritage decay or rot away or become irreparable before they finally get around to try to preserve it.
Well, that seems to be the case, and I think what it really takes, and certainly is what it took here in Vincennes, for certain groups to take a real focused look at and do some long-range planning on exactly what they want to do in developing and their historical heritage. And it was decided to make this a part of the national park system, and President Lyndon Johnson came to Vincennes at that time on the steps of this memorial and signed a bill that turned the George Rogers Clark Memorial over to the National Park Service. And I think personally that our real development of history in this area and the focus that went along with it started with having the National Park Service in the community. They are just magnificent. Everything they do is first class, and we're just very pleased, happy, and proud to have them.
We cannot overlook the influence of the Catholic Church here. If we look over here just to our left, there is what is affectionately called the Old Cathedral, which was the seat of the Catholic Church for this entire area at one time, was it not?
Oh, yeah. In fact, this was the Diocese of Vincennes covered an incredible amount of country at one time, going to the Canadian line, up into Illinois and Wisconsin. The first bishop of Vincennes was Father or Bishop Brutet, who came from France, brought his library with him. They still have the library here. And this was the rather famed Diocese of Vincennes till it moved to Indianapolis in the 1890s. Of course, the church itself goes back to about 1735. So the church was much older, but the diocese at that time was out of Bardstown, Kentucky.
You know, it's hard to imagine how priests, bishops, ministers, rabbis, whatever religion came out here to the prairie, how much riding they had to do to get between congregations. I mean, the bishop, for example, if he had to go to a special ceremony, right now we're in the Evansville Catholic Diocese, the farthest the bishop would have to go would maybe be about an hour and 20 minutes. But back then, if the bishop based here in Vincennes had to go, let's say, up into Michigan, it would take a week to get there.
Yes, and it's interesting that the bishops did travel quite a bit, and they would travel by coach. I'm sure some of the early bishops would travel by river transportation, by horseback, all kinds of ways to get out and serve their parishioners. Of course, by the time the Diocese of Vincennes was constructed or was created, why, there was probably a much better organization for this. And at this time, there were a number of churches throughout the Midwest serving the Catholic citizens of the area. And Vincennes, by the way, was heavily Catholic because of its French heritage. And the old cathedral today, and we still call it the old cathedral, the official name is St. Francis Xavier Catholic Church, but the old cathedral today has kept their records. We have them in the historical library, or copies of them, and they are certainly a boon to genealogists. I would imagine those old cathedral records, studying the early French, are used about as much as anything that we have.
While we've been talking here, there have been a dozen or so, mostly students, young people, going up into the memorial here. How important is it economically to a city such as Vincennes, a city of 20,000 plus, to have a magnet like this? And what kind of visitors, from where all do you see them coming?
They come from all parts of the world, really. We have fairly good highways through Vincennes. There are no interstates, but we have Highway 41, which runs from Chicago south. We have Highway 50, US 50, so we are at crossroads in that respect. And only 35 miles south of here, we have it's one of the guns. They're doing a demonstration on the other side of the memorial. And 35 miles south of here, we have Interstate 64. So there's access to Vincennes, and we do draw. We can sit on these steps, and I'm sure hundreds of people will be coming by today just to go inside the memorial. And then we have a very nice visitor center, which the National Park constructed and maintains as well.
I know there's so many things to talk about here, and I guess I'm a little bit of an advantage as a reporter, having worked here for so long early on. There was a gentleman who lived here for many years, I guess probably approached the age of 90. At one time, he was the oldest practicing attorney in Indiana. He and several of his cohorts, when he was very young, founded Sigma Pi fraternity, which is why the national headquarters is here. And he was one of the justices at the Nuremberg war crimes trials. We're talking about Judge Curtis Shake. Of all the people I think I met in the time I was here in Vincennes, he instilled in me, just by his manner, such a sense of heritage about this place.
Well, that was Kurt Shake. He was a grand person. He was a graduate of Indiana University in the class of 1910. He spent a lifetime serving the people of Indiana and serving the nation. He was the Chief Justice of the Indiana Supreme Court, and after World War II, he was appointed one of the judges at the Nuremberg war trials in Nuremberg, Germany. And his famous case over there as Chief Justice of his group was the I.G. Farben case.
It was slave labor in industry?
It was an industrial complex of some kind. I'm not really up on I.G. Farben. I think it still exists today, but it was a large chemical operation. I wouldn't compare it with DuPont, but in size and everything, it could be very similar to at that magnitude of that size. And he came back. He practiced law, always interested in history. He was very instrumental in getting Vincennes University through some of the real hard times of the 1920s and later the Depression. And he also had a great interest in the history of this community. And much of our heritage today he was able to hold together and keep until more people really got interested in it.
Let's talk about the university. It is a 2-year school. It's Indiana's only junior college. I mean, there are some states, New York, New Jersey, California, have immense junior college systems. Indiana has a lot of little 4-year schools, Taylor, Hanover, I'm thinking of Rensselaer, Earlham in Richmond, but there is but one junior college. It's my understanding that by the 1950s, that little junior college, which at the time was housed in one building downtown, had gotten down to just several hundred students, and it was just kind of a little lackluster place. You couldn't even transfer from there.
Well, the graduating class of 1946 was about 11 students.
Smaller than I thought.
But speaking on behalf of Vincennes University, it is the oldest college in the Indiana Territory, which covers all the states that I told you about earlier in the broadcast. It's been around a long time. It's Indiana's, it's still called a university because it was chartered as the Vincennes University for the Indiana Territory in 1806. It had started as Jefferson Academy in 1801, so it's going to be approaching in just a few years its 200th anniversary. And it survived. It survived a lot of hard times through the various depressions and such. But Vincennes University today is an incredibly strong a student body of 7,000 or 8,000. It has a statewide mission. It is a state institution. And as opposed to those very private, very fine private schools that you mentioned a few moments ago.
So, but before you move to today, though, let me pay tribute to another citizen here. When I was in college here, in junior college, a very energetic fellow who almost talked more than I did, Isaac Beckus, had become president. And and I always thought 60 Minutes or something should have done a tribute to what happened. He took that little school, moved it to a city park, started buying used buildings, a used brewery, a used power plant, started moving buildings around, bought buildings from the military, and all of a sudden came up with this concept that a student should have a choice. Either go for only 2 years and learn a trade, or be able to fully transfer to Purdue or MIT or Indiana University. The magic is, and I want you to flesh this out, they started buying businesses here in town to train students in.
That's right. We had the cable company for a good many years, pioneered CATV, or cable television, in the community. Isaac Beckus always said that Vincennes University, as he had developed it after 1950, was the best secondhand college in the country, and I think he was right. And much of the success, of course, that we've had flow from him. He was a great man. There's just no question about it. And he dealt with the junior college systems of the country on a national scale. He was on many of the national committees of the Association of Junior Colleges, and Vincennes University grew to great size while he was here, and it has continued growing under Dr. Philip Summers, who is the president now.
So they bought a bowling alley. Is that what I'm thinking
right.
of?
And
they've got you can take nursing. You can learn to be a mortician. It's got one of the best robotic schools in America. They bought an airport. The cable TV system went on the air in 59 or 60, I think.
That's right.
I mean, it just amazed me that instead of building, which they would do eventually with more funding. I mean, one of the nicest radio and TV centers in the country is here. But they went out and actually bought existing businesses and said, we're going to train these kids to be automotive mechanics. Let's buy a garage.
Yeah, we had to have more space and more buildings, so we bought an old defunct brewery. And for many years, in fact,
that's where I took journalism.
A couple of the brewery buildings are still being used on campus. But Vincennes University today is a beautiful campus of high-rise buildings, and it has a state mission. It draws students from all 92 counties in Indiana. We have expanded into a very sizable campus in Jasper, Indiana. We have an outreach in way up in northern Indiana in Elkhart, we have at the Indianapolis Airport, the United Terminal, we have courses of study in airplane mechanics, and also we're at Fort Benjamin Harris in Indianapolis. So we do have a statewide mission today, and but most of that growth really and truly has come since World War II is over.
We're not too far from the corner of 5th and Main, and there's an old theater there called the Pantheon, which is now used as office space. This fellow, whose name I'm not going to say yet, I interviewed him one time, and he told the story. He was selling newspapers out in front of the Pantheon at 5th and Main, was 10 years old, and he went in, and he noticed that a comedian from New York was playing, and he went back out, and this fellow came in from out of town and said to him, "What do you do for excitement?" And the young newspaper boy says, "Well, there's a really funny guy from New York is going to be here. I'd really like to see him, but I don't have the money." And the young boy, now old, tells the story that the visitor bought all of his newspapers and gave him the money, and he went in and recognized that the fellow who had bought his newspapers was Ed Wynn.
That's right.
And that man was Red Skelton.
That's right. And that's the Red Skelton, that's one of the more famous Red Skelton stories. Red Skelton was born here in Vincennes and grew up here in Vincennes. At a very young age, he was involved with a number of Midwestern acts, including Clarence Stout's Minstrels. He was with medicine shows. His success speaks for itself. He's probably America's favorite clown, and Vincennes is very proud of him. I think one thing we do in Vincennes, and we have a great school system here, and our teachers in Vincennes use the resource of the people who are available, even the old guys like you and I, to come into the classroom and talk to the students, and not so much tell them, but to answer the questions they might have about their community and what they perceive their community to be. And I think that this little old town of Vincennes does as good a job of that as any town I've ever heard of trying to interface their young people with the people who live in the community.
Isn't there a really good argument you can make economically for the importance of it? I mean, this monument here, the tourism, draws a lot of money to this city.
Millions. It is amazing, and the people who do that the best are the National Park Service. They know what kind of crowds they're getting, and I think, and the Chamber of Commerce, of course, works at it too. But we do have some measuring sticks, and we know what value it is. And I think one of the things that these people have done in this community, they have been able to cause a stable existence to take place in the historical community. It's a class act. We've tried to be accurate when depicting our history. We have tried not to be outlandish in some of the things we say about our history, and I think that we have earned the respect of people who come in who say, "Isn't that interesting?" And what's more interesting is that that's exactly the way it happened.
One final thing. What kind of reaction have you seen, particularly from young students? You work with them in the schools. You've been out here a lot. Your son was a park ranger for a year. I'm sure you spent time with him. There's the historical center. There is so much crowded into a 4 or 5 block area. When the light bulb comes on and a grade school student begins to realize that, hey, there used to be boats up and down here. This was the main highway. There was no bridge. You had to use a ferry. All of this is to remember the past. What kind of comments do you get?
We get a lot of comments like that. And at the Historical Library at Vincennes, we get a lot of Vincennes University students who are doing English themes and themes for their history classes. And they find this resource that we have in this community. And so, and also when they go back into their own communities, they try to relate that to their own communities and say, well, how does my community compare to the community of Vincennes? I had one student some years ago, and I said, where are you from? And he told me, and I said, what kind of town is that? He said, it's just like Vincennes without the monuments.
Gus Stevens, thanks a lot for a very long-term friendship, and you have one more thing you want to add.
I have one more thing to say. There's one man we haven't really thanked, and that's a man by the name of Paul Dresser, who wrote a song about this river in 1900 called On the Banks of the Wabash, Far Away. Thank you, Paul. You've helped us a lot.
Gus Stevens of Vincennes University, thanks a lot.
Oh, thank you, Dennis. Nice to be with you.
One of the most historic cities in the U.S., tucked away on the Wabash River, or should I say, hidden away on the Wabash. I'm Dennis Daly.